All right, so we are going to track a number of civil rights issues specific to particular groups. We're going to start out talking about the issue of black civil rights. And for that, right, we would begin with the year 1619. That is the year in which British slave traders bring to the American colonies the first slaves from the west coast of Africa. Now, interestingly enough, slavery in its earliest years in the colonies was relatively non-racialized. There were Native American slaves, there were black slaves, there were white slaves. But by about 1650, slavery increasingly became racialized and then codified into law as a racial construct, right? Specific to one racial group in particular, black people brought over from Africa. And so it begins. Now, by the time we get to the year 1776, right, and the Americans declare their desire for independence from the mother country, Great Britain, we know that that revolution is successful. We gain our independence, and we draft a governing document that we now call the U.S. Constitution in the year 1787. It's ratified by the following year, 1788. And we've already talked about that, right? That slavery by then, since it had begun in 1619, codified into law as a racial construct by 1650 or thereabouts. And so by 1787, right, this is an institution that has taken deep root. It has become a powerful institution economically, politically, legally, and culturally. Right, so it is a massive fact by 1787. And so not shockingly, it gets built into the fabric of that original Constitution through, most obviously, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the future-oriented ban on the slave trade from Africa. All right. Now, pretty quickly, right, and really all along, you had abolitionist forces fighting back against slavery as an immoral institution that was not worthy of America, but they consistently lose. But they consistently build power over time as America evolves in all sorts of ways. And what became a big deal relatively early on in America's evolution is our growth to the West, right? The growth of the American empire across the continent towards the Pacific Ocean and down to the Chesapeake Bay with the Louisiana Purchase and so on. So we're rapidly growing west, right? And so the question becomes pretty early on, what about slavery as we grow west? Right? Will these new territories and then states, will they be free or slave? Right, that becomes the burning issue in American politics. The first effort to address this in a way that holds us together is the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that basically said any states or territories that we create south of this Mason-Dixon line that was created will be slave states and territories, and any territories and states to the north of that line will be free territories and states. All right? That was a compromise that held together for about 30 years. Now, the problem for the southern states was that Mason-Dixon line was pretty far to the south, right? So that as we grew west, as we grew to the Pacific Ocean, there were going to be a whole lot of free states being added north of that line and not that many slave states. So the South, right, got into a bit of a panic as they realized that this wasn't working out the way that they thought it would, and that they were going to soon be overwhelmed by the number of free states, and they will be outmaneuvered in Congress. So they were like, well, that's not going to get it done. We need to revisit this. And so we revisited it in 1850, the California Compromise, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And what these two pieces of legislation essentially meant was that as we grew west, each state could choose for itself autonomously whether to be slave or free. Right? The Mason-Dixon line was thrown out of the window, and we would just allow each state to choose for itself whether to be free or slave. Right? That was a much better deal for the South. It gave them a fighting chance to create more slave states as we grew west. And that, that kind of held us together, but, we were hurtling towards this, we know now, Civil War. And what really precipitated it and made it happen a bit quicker and more certainly was a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857, Dred Scott, in which the court could have really left that larger issue of slavery and Congress alone to resolve that case. They merely needed to rule as they did that Dred Scott was not a citizen, therefore could not sue for his freedom in court, didn't have standing. The court wouldn't recognize him as a legitimate petitioner. They could have stopped there and resolved it narrowly, but they want to resolve it in a big way, right? So Chief Justice Roger Taney goes big, and he says, not only does Dred Scott not have standing to sue for his freedom as a black man, but Congress can no longer speak to the issue of slavery. That the Fifth Amendment, because back then, remember, the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government, did not apply to the states. So what does the Fifth Amendment specify? That if the government, in this case Congress, is going to take away your property, they have to provide just compensation. Right? So the court said that applies to Congress and slavery. If Congress wants to abolish slavery in any state, they cannot do that unless they provide just compensation to slave owners. And we couldn't afford to do that. At this time, there was more money invested in slaves than in the railroads, okay? i.e., the bulk of American capital was invested in slaves. So we literally could not afford to compensate slave owners in order to buy them out, right, and escape slavery in that way. That had been floated by some, including Lincoln, early days. Maybe we could buy our way out of slavery, but we couldn't afford it, all right? So the court said, since Congress cannot afford to compensate slave owners and they're bound by the Fifth Amendment, they cannot do this. Slaves are property, and the Fifth Amendment protects the slave owners in their property interests. That does not apply to the states, right? The Bill of Rights did not apply to the states yet. So the states, if they chose to, could abolish slavery. They didn't have to provide just compensation. The states could also endorse slavery and build it into their politics, right? But it's up to the states. It's a states' rights issue. And so what did that tell the abolitionist forces in America? That Congress, there was no longer the hope that Congress could eventually abolish slavery nationally. That hope was taken away from them. It would be up to the states, right? And they knew that the southern states would never surrender slavery, would never surrender that. So this made them feel, right, like this has come to a head. It's one or the other, all right? Lincoln's elected in 1860. He was known to be not an abolitionist per se, but hostile to slavery. And so this freaked the South out. And so they seceded from the Union. Civil War, 1860. Or it might have been 1860. Was it 61? Maybe late 1860. Anyway, that leads to Civil War, which we were probably headed to anyway. It just brings it about a little faster. We know that the United States triumphs in that war. They drag the southern states back into the Union, and they impose upon the South Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment mandating that states must provide equal protection to all citizens, and they provided birthright citizenship, right? If you were born in America, you were automatically a citizen, i.e. all former slaves were all citizens now, and therefore protected by the Equal Protection Clause against the states. And the 15th Amendment, right, that tells the states you cannot deny suffrage on the basis of race. And there were additional federal laws designed to protect the newly freed slaves from the southern people and governments. Right, that's Reconstruction. Enforced by the U.S. military under President, now formerly General, now President Ulysses S. Grant. All right, so I think as we had discussed already, really, when we talked about American federalism, right, what happens with Reconstruction? Because during Reconstruction, free blacks were doing quite well, right? They were getting elected to Congress. They were getting their community back on its feet economically. Things were moving in a very positive direction. Now, look, it's going to be super challenging, right? This is a people that have been in bondage for, 1619, 1719, 18, for about 240 years, right? They had been in bondage for 240 years. How do you build back from that? It's very challenging, right? But Reconstruction created the space to do that. So I'm not saying Reconstruction was perfect, but it was pretty damn good. It collapses by 1877, right? Our book talks about that. Read it. It collapses by 1877. The Republican Party, right, that had been the champion of abolitionism and then free blacks post-Civil War, they essentially abandoned black citizens in America to pursue other political allies like the emerging large corporations that were evolving at this time as we industrialized. And the Democratic Party, right, is not going to be a home for black people either, because historically the Democratic Party was the party of the white South and slavery. So that wasn't an option. Right? So free blacks in America are left to their own devices, abandoned by both political parties. So once President Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, pulls the military out of the South, everything slides downhill for free blacks. And at that time, right, nearly all blacks in America lived in the South. You get the return of slavery. You really do. De facto, you get the return of slavery via sharecropping and the criminal justice system. Sharecropping, right, given that a lot of free blacks at this time didn't really have their own businesses because they couldn't afford it, especially once Reconstruction collapsed, their only option was to work on the farms where they used to be slaves. And then states would pass laws that said if you're a sharecropper, i.e. black people, working a white person's farm, you're bound to that land. And there's almost no way to escape that legally. It's complicated. Google it, look it up, do some research. But sharecropping effectively tied black people to these white-owned farms with no real methods or means of escape. It was very similar to slavery. And then the criminal justice system. If you look at that 13th Amendment, and I think we fixed that here, the version here in Nevada. In our state constitution, there's a version of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment says it forbids slavery and involuntary servitude except in cases of punishment in the criminal justice system. Right? That's a little carve-out, a sad and tragic carve-out that we should really get rid of. But it's a carve-out. And so what did white state and local governments do after the collapse of Reconstruction? They essentially de facto made it a crime to be a black man in the South at this time. And so huge numbers of black men were funneled into the criminal justice system, convicted of typically made up crimes by all white juries, and then incarcerated under brutal conditions and forced to work on plantations for no money, right? Prison chain gangs. That looks an awful lot like slavery. Right? So between sharecropping and the criminal justice system, boom, the 13th Amendment is de facto overturned. The imposition of Jim Crow, right? Racial segregation across the South, the deprivation of voting rights based on race, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan to enforce a lot of this racial segregation and racial subordination and racial hierarchy. So I cannot even tell you in words. The words are not adequate to explain the tragedy of the collapse of Reconstruction by 1877. And the Supreme Court, right, who you think might have stood up to this as a violation of the terms of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which it was, the court says, no, we're good with it. We're on board with this. Good example, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. In which the court held that racial segregation is indeed constitutional, is consistent with the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. All right, so from the ashes of the collapse of Reconstruction emerges slowly over the decades, an emerging nascent struggle for black civil rights. And so I would say certainly by the 1930s, you start to see, right, this phoenix rising from the ashes of destruction. You see it a little bit with the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, right, a Democrat. He saw increasingly that since Republicans had abandoned black people, and black people were moving north, by the way, via this thing called the Great Migration, he began to recognize that there's an opportunity here for the Democratic Party to add black people to their coalition to win elections, right? So you begin to see the green shoots of a renaissance here for black people during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the New Deal. And there were a number of outreach efforts to address some of the concerns of black people in a changing, evolving America, all right? And then World War II kind of accelerates that, right? Because with World War II, black people are serving in a segregated military, by the way, and they spend time over in Europe in countries like France, and they realize, oh, over in France we get treated rather well as black people. In America we get treated like crap. Right? So they come back feeling, in some ways, right, angry and empowered. And so I think, and as part of that, right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's successor is Harry Truman. Harry Truman sees the same political opportunities that FDR did. And apropos of that, and for other reasons, Truman issues an executive order after World War II to desegregate racially the U.S. military. Right, so the Democratic Party is sending out signals that we're ready to add black people to our coalition and take their political concerns seriously. And then, right, you get the beginnings of a black civil rights movement led by black people, where the primary participants are black people. And it is a mass movement. You see it really as early as 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education, where the NAACP argues that racially segregated public schools violate the 14th Amendment, and they surely do, deny equal protection to black students. And the court decides unanimously, headed up by Chief Justice Earl Warren, that indeed the 14th Amendment does forbid racially segregated public schools. That's a big deal, right? And it's argued, by the way, by the lead counsel for the NAACP, which at that time was Thurgood Marshall, who ends up, of course, being the first black Supreme Court justice put there by Lyndon B. Johnson later on. That is followed by the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56, led by a charismatic young preacher by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. That might sound familiar. They're successful in integrating public transit in Montgomery. Then the White South fights back. Man, they fight back. And you look at that timeline I have up there on the slide. Right, there's kind of a gap, isn't there, between the bus boycott in 56 and the lunch counter sit-ins in 60. What's happening between 56 and 60? Not much in terms of progress for the movement, because they're back on their heels as the White South realizes this is serious. We need to nip this in the bud. We need to fight back hard. So for a number of years, the movement doesn't know what to do. It doesn't have any room to do anything. The White South is on high alert. But they get their mojo back in 1960 with young people, college students. And they engage in these lunch counter sit-ins to challenge racial segregation in the South. And the media covers those sit-ins. And they show you that a lot of white people reacted to these sit-ins with violence, naked violence. And who did the white police officers arrest? The black protesters who were engaged in peaceful civil disobedience. They were disobeying laws, right? But those laws were Jim Crow and segregationist. So that begins to get the attention of the American public, right? They start to see these images in the South that indicate to the North, oh, wait a minute, right? There's a problem down in the South. We're no longer going to avert our gaze. We're going to look. And when we look, we're not happy with what we see. This is a bit much. Then you get the freedom rides in 61. These bus rides across the South to challenge segregation in public transportation. And again, it precipitates violence by white people directed at peaceful black protesters. The media covers it, right? And again, the North is increasingly troubled by what they see happening in the South. And then, critically here, you get the marches, right? The mass marches. In Birmingham, Alabama, most particularly, that's the one that you may know of, with the police dogs and the fire hoses and the police brutality against child protesters, children. They brutalized these children with the German shepherds and the fire hoses and the tear gas and the whole bit, right? And the media covers this, and it convinces the North this is total bullshit. This is 1963. And then, of course, the march in Washington, D.C., where Dr. Martin Luther King, who has now become a prominent leader of the movement, gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And that really gets the attention not only of the American people, but also a young President John F. Kennedy. More on that in just a bit. Okay, so shortly after King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech in the late summer of '63, right, that's really targeted at two things. It's targeted at the American people broadly, and it's targeted at President John F. Kennedy. Because Kennedy had been loath to act on behalf of the movement. He had delegated a lot of these issues for the first 3 years of his presidency to his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. But here, the movement finally gets Kennedy's direct attention. and Kennedy, in a sense, is shamed into finally doing something himself. So shortly after this March on Washington, Kennedy proposes civil rights legislation to Congress. He proposes it, right? He proposes it. And shortly thereafter, in the fall of '63, he is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. LBJ, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, a guy out of Texas with not a good record on civil rights, succeeds him as president. But for reasons that I won't go into here, it's complicated. LBJ turns out to be a great champion of black civil rights, much to the shock and surprise of the movement. Because leadership in the movement was really worried when LBJ became president. Turns out he was probably better than Kennedy would have been. And he helps push through Congress a really strong civil rights bill that becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The movement is not satisfied, right? To them, that's not enough, although it's a lot. They push as well for a bill on voting rights. They march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they are tear gassed and beaten by officers on horseback. Peaceful protesters, tear gassed, the whole 9 yards, right? America watches again because television news covers it. And Lyndon B. Johnson, who wasn't all that inclined to push for voting rights necessarily, he gets on board. The public's on board. Congress is on board. And we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 on a bipartisan basis, by the way. Both laws, bipartisan support. In fact, there was a bit more support in Congress from Republicans. Because historically, the Democratic Party was the party of the white South. The Republican Party was the party of black people. So some of that's still there as late as 1965. And these are meaningful laws, right, that have really been important. They essentially, they're called America's second Reconstruction, right? Our second crack at Reconstruction, because the first one failed. Much more successful than the first Reconstruction. So the Black Civil Rights Movement has had great success, right? Campaigning across the South to address de jure racial segregation and discrimination. They get tremendous accomplishments out of that. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, landmark major legislation. And then they shift their target to the North, right? Because of that great migration that occurred, black people fleeing the South to the North. from about 1920 to about 1970. Right now there's a lot of black people living in the North in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and so on. So they shift their gaze to the North, where there are also racial problems, right? Now, the issue here is, right, the racial discrimination and segregation in the North is not written into law, right? It's not de jure, it's de facto. That as a matter of fact, there is systemic discrimination against black people in education, in housing, in employment, right? It's not like the North was ever a nirvana or utopia for black people. It was just, comparatively, I suppose, better than the South, but super problematic in all sorts of ways, right? So the movement shifts its focus to the North, and the North is not happy about that. They were happy to promote the reformation of the South, not as happy to address their own issues. Plus, it's not as obvious, right? It's not written into law. So it's not written into law. We good. And I was like, well, maybe you're not good. Maybe there's de facto problems here. Segregation in education, de facto in the North, absolutely. Then and now. Inequality and opportunity in the job market based on race, 100% de facto, not de jure. Discrimination in housing, de facto, not de jure in the North, 100%, right? But the North fights back really hard. The North fights back really hard. Look at that graphic, that picture on that slide. That was in Boston in a protest over, I believe, busing. Busing was an effort, right, to address de facto racial segregation in public education. White people in the North did not like that at all. Busing was never widely popular, period. Affirmative action, right? Then and now, not very popular, much more controversial. So this makes the movement less popular. Plus the movement starts to fragment, right? It's hard to hold the movement together for a long time. It starts to fragment, starts to radicalize. You get the rise of the Black Panthers, figures like Malcolm X. White Americans are increasingly uncomfortable with all of this, believe that, we've done enough on civil rights, let's move on to other things. We're sick of this. White people also, by the way, move out to the suburbs. They leave big cities that are increasingly occupied by black people. So you get all that happening. A lot of white backlash. That's why we get Richard Nixon in '68 as a law and order guy, and again in '72. What did law and order mean as a campaign slogan? Law and order administered to black people. And white Americans are drawn to that. I understand why. I don't love it, but I understand why. And then, of course, right, King is assassinated in '68. And that's really the end of an era of progress on black civil rights. All right, so by 1968, the movement really fails. Right, so you would typically define the Black Civil Rights Movement as in existence from 1954 to 1968, bracketed by Brown v. Board on the front end and the assassination of King on the other. Now, that moves us right into a sort of more of a contemporary time frame, and on something like the efforts to racially integrate our public schools K through 12. We know from the data that peaked, that movement towards racial integration in public schools K through 12 peaked in about 1988. And since then, and there's, I think, a graph in our book, I believe, that covers that. Right. Since then, there's been a slide towards resegregation by race of America's public schools K through 12. Not because of laws or de jure, but de facto. Just there's a and I understand why, a lack of political will to do what it takes to create more racially integrated public schools K through 12. Because it's so tied into housing segregation that it's really hard to get at unless you get at housing segregation. And we're just not going to do that. We're just not going to do that. That nut is too big, too hard to crack. Right? So we use alternative approaches that are like a Band-Aid without getting to the source problem. Right? Things like busing or affirmative action, versions of affirmative action. And Americans, right, especially white Americans, have become increasingly hostile to those sorts of Band-Aid efforts. And so that's essentially what's happened. And you see that as well with the U.S. Supreme Court. You can track sort of that growing lack of political will, and I understand why, to do what it might take to address these issues without getting to the root cause, which is clearly a political impossibility. You can see it through sort of the position of the U.S. Supreme Court on these things. Yeah. So there's sort of the court initially says, well, busing, yes. And then they say, well, busing, but only in limited circumstances. That essentially start to mean no busing at all. And then they say, well, affirmative action under some conditions, yes. But now they're at a position where they're saying, well, not really, no. And then I think they're on their brink of saying under no conditions at all. I think that's what they're going to decide in the next few days or weeks. So the courts drift away from that commitment, which I understand why. Sort of captures the broader drift in America away from these more proactive solutions that would create more integrated public schools. But some believe at too high a cost. I get it. Issues today, right? Issues of race and policing. And we see sort of Black Lives Matter as a way to represent that issue politically. The issue of race and incarceration as a result of the war on drugs over many decades. It's an ongoing issue, by the way. Race and education, an ongoing issue. Significant inequalities there yet, de facto. Increasingly, right, battles over voting rights. We saw that when we talked a little bit about, right, the decline of home rule in Republican-dominated states, where increasingly, honestly, white Republican-dominated legislatures are seeking to make it a bit harder to access voting rights, are looking to take over the administration of elections in cities that even in red states, right, are typically run by black Democrats of color. So you could argue, and I don't want to push this too far, but I do think we are seeing, if you think of Nixon and his election in '68 and re-election in '72 as white America's retribution against the black civil rights agenda, which they believe had gone off the rails and gone too far by 1968, I get it. Right? So if Nixon was their retribution, right, isn't that in a sense what Trump is promising? Is that if you re-elect me in 2024, I will be your retribution. What's the subtext to that? People can see in it what they want, I suppose. But to me, as someone deeply attentive to history, it seems quintessentially Nixonian. So that's kind of where we're at, right? Race relations today are not super fantastic. Are not super fantastic. The struggle continues. That history, right, that we have going back to 1619, it reverberates yet today. Very hard, if not impossible, to ever escape one's history. We drag it behind us, right, like a long train of tin cans.